Alright, so I know dejected detachment is sort of my thing at this point, and this might be a bit concerning to hear, but I've actually been looking forward to making this video for a really long time now. I mean, I probably shouldn't be, considering this is the first time I've ever been warned about the reaction I'm walking into, but being able to act self-righteous and persecuted because people didn't like my video game opinion just sounds like a whole new experience to me. And with the way that things have been going lately, it's probably not the best idea to be shooting those down. Jokes aside, I can't help but notice how quickly discussions about these games tend to devolve into playground slap fights, and since I'm not too keen on getting myself glassed with a carton of strawberry milk, I don't think I can go any further without addressing the Paladins as an Overwatch clone in the room. I'm gonna try to keep it brief, since I've had this argument at least twice over the past few years, and I already know it's more or less pointless, but I also know it's unavoidable since I regularly see people cry about similarities to a character so generic people nicknamed him Call of Duty. And I know this is a bit of a tangent, but I've always felt like that nickname was given to the wrong person. I know I can't speak for everyone here, but dying to random grenade spam, martyrdom, and RCXDs sounds a whole lot more like my experiences with that franchise than fighting people who actually have to aim, which... Okay, point taken. All I'm trying to say is that I find it weird how people are so quick to write Paladins off as nothing more than a cheap Overwatch clone for its derivative elements, while seemingly being aware of the fact that Overwatch isn't a particularly original game itself a lot of the time. And working on this video for the past few months knowing that a good chunk of people were going to ignore everything I was saying to make that claim got me feeling pretty vaccinated. So I did what comes naturally to the immunized and compiled a spreadsheet of every system, mechanic, and mode in Overwatch to point out games where they existed prior so that I could throw it in the description and make this claim without having to bog the video down with endless examples. From a purely mechanical and systematic standpoint, Overwatch is not an original game. A solid 95% of the mechanics and abilities in Overwatch are derivative, and not a single system is unique. What gives Overwatch its identity are the ways it combines these derivative elements in order to make something new and different, which is exactly the same as what Paladins does. Now, I may be able to jump into ball pits without having to worry about losing the ability to jump at all, but I'm not a complete moron. I'm not going to claim that Paladins has never directly lifted ideas from Overwatch. I'm just saying that there are enough differences for me to think it's not fair to completely write it off as just being the poor man's alternative. Also, for anyone who was wondering, when I made that spreadsheet I discovered that the most original character in Overwatch is Moira, which in retrospect makes a lot of sense since her visual design won't stop screaming "do not steal" at me. Again, my point is not that Overwatch stole this stuff or that Paladins isn't derivative. I just find the originality argument annoying when Paladins entered development back in 2012 and only about 1 out of every 20 abilities in Overwatch is original to begin with. And when that fraction consists of things like Hanzo's scatter arrow and Symmetra's microwave, I can't help but think they're original not because no one else thought of them, but because everyone else thought about them. Which actually segues me pretty nicely into talking about the games themselves, so I guess it's time to move on from the part of the video that everyone came here for. Thanks for stopping by, and just a heads up from someone who learned the hard way, you should probably take Friends off that Christmas list. Now, I'd like to start by talking about something that isn't necessarily a part of the way these games are designed, but something that'll be much more immediately obvious to anyone who takes the time to play both of them, namely the borderline comical gap in production value and polish. In fairness, the term Blizzard polish exists for a reason. The game is obviously going to be mostly bug-free and very pretty, likely with an art style that blends cartoony and realistic graphics with a cast of characters cut from different colored sections of the exact same piece of marble. Pretty much anyone is going to look bad next to Blizzard in this department, but while they were designing a theme park, Hi-Rez have been running a circus. I mentioned earlier that this is a video I've been wanting to make for a while now, which might have confused some people given that I haven't exactly been finding the cure for cancer in the meantime. One of the main reasons it took me so long is that I wanted to wait for Paladins to get out of beta so that I can make a more fair comparison here, and now that I've actually done that, I've come to the realization that I'm a fucking moron because Paladins is a high-res game, and regardless of whatever numbers they decide to slap on their patches, it never actually will. Well, that's not completely fair. Beta does sort of imply that there are still updates to come. I may like Paladins quite a bit, and spoiler alert for the rest of this video, I do, but it'd be a bit dishonest for me not to mention that the game is held together with tape and spit. There are the more immediately obvious issues, like the fact that several skins and champions still don't have splash art during the loading screens, and then there are the outright inexcusable ones, like the bug with Strix's ultimate when you run the game in DirectX 11. If you haven't played the game, or have been lucky enough to have never played against this dickhead, his ultimate ability is a wide radius flashbang grenade, which is supposed to flash your screen a pure blinding white and then slowly fade back down to the gameplay with an imprint of the last thing you saw slightly obscuring your vision. You've played video games? But if you're using DirectX 11, it fades from pure white down to pure black and then smash cuts back to the game once the effect has worn off entirely. That means that anyone at the center of the explosion explosion is completely blinded for 3 entire seconds. If something like that had made it into Overwatch, it would at least be broken by design. I guess it just boils down to personal preference. Either throw your computer out the window over something that might eventually get changed, or over something that might eventually get fixed. Not that I'd hold my breath for either. It's a good measuring stick though. Making this review has definitely made me realize how much more important a game's systems and mechanics are than polish when it comes to holding my interest for a long period of time. And that's not me trying to imply that Overwatch is a shallower game than Paladins. That's me trying to say it outright because it definitely is. And the easiest way to show that is to talk about the differences in how the two games handle the hero part of the term hero shooter. In both games, characters can be categorized into one of 4 base classes: supports, DPS, tanks, and flanks. Technically, Overwatch only has 3 of these classifications, but that's just because they abandoned the attack and defense categories when they realized it discouraged creative team compositions in modes with attack and defense phases, which is a little bit ironic given how restrictive the hero designs themselves tend to be. Every character feels as though they're designed to fulfill a single specific job, which is good in the sense that it keeps heroes from being redundant, and if nothing else, you have to hand it to Blizzard for being great businessmen. I think when they saw that someone made the most successful competitive game of all time by going, hey, what if Dota was reasonable? They thought to themselves, what if we did that, but for video games? It's certainly hard to argue against its effectiveness. Assigning every character a specific role makes the game significantly easier to get into, because the second you pick a hero, it's hard not to understand what you're supposed to be doing. But the catch there is that what you're supposed to be doing is the only thing you can do. The kits given to Overwatch's heroes are generally pretty fun to play around with, but by streamlining them to this degree, Blizzard has carved out a distinct, correct way to play each of them, and I can't help but see that as a misunderstanding of what makes hero-based games interesting long-term. I love some of the playstyles they've carved out. Perfectly timing Zarya bubbles and face tanking damage to keep your energy up so that you can melt enemies is incredibly fun and satisfying to pull off consistently. But when it's all you're doing in every game, it gets stale pretty quickly. Heroes in Overwatch are meant to be played as, not with. I don't have a playstyle with Zarya. Zarya has a playstyle. The only major benefits of streamlining to this degree is that it theoretically makes balancing easier, because you can directly nerf and buff a hero's single defining strength rather than dealing with the intricacies of an actual kit. So I guess that explains why Overwatch has never struggled with the sort of balance issues of other competitive games. The more I think about this stuff, the more I realize that a big part of why Zenyatta is still my favorite character is that he's one of the only heroes on the roster who feels as though he was designed to fulfill a role rather than to have a job. In fact, when the game came out, Zenyatta's kit was criticized because his ultimate didn't mesh with how players positioned with him, and the fact that they buffed it by just adding some movement speed made him viable without sidelining him into a single specific box. He debuffs enemies, heals his teammates, and is capable of dishing out both sustained and burst damage, but said damage is relatively difficult to land consistently, and he has a low health pool with no mobility or self-peel. So he has distinct strengths and weaknesses and an identity without being designed entirely around a single job. If every hero was designed like Zen or Zarya, I wouldn't mind the game being shallower than Paladins so much, because I'd still find it fun and dynamic to play in other ways, but unfortunately most of them aren't. The game is riddled with characters like Mercy, who is so basic I don't feel the need to explain what I'm saying here, and McCree, who feels as though his entire kit was designed around killing Pharmacy, Tracer, and Sombra, so you're never picking him because his kit is cool and brings an interesting dynamic to the team, you're picking him because he's rock and they have scissors. Or you really want to fuck him, which I apparently can't rule out for anyone. If the new hero designs are anything to go by, I think they might have actually realized that this was an issue, but transitioning from heroes who are designed to do one thing into heroes whose kits have everything you could possibly need is just hopping out of the frying pan and into the fuck corridor. Moira is really fun, but the only real counterplay for her evil Orbeez is D.Va's defense matrix, which is countered by Moira's mean beam anyways, and Brigitte is a war crime. Regardless of any joy I get out of playing them, I wouldn't ever call them well designed. Moira's only drawbacks are the lack of a hard CC and the fact that her ultimate can be interrupted, but her ultimate can be used effectively at any range, and she has an invisible, untargetable, fully controllable, omnidirectional dash, so crowd control isn't really required for her to self-peel. Regardless of how balanced they may be, their kits are undeniably bloated, which is why I'm glad this seems to have been a second learning period and they finally started designing characters to be more general purpose and fun to play without just shoving in everything all at once. Bakugan Battle Hamster's kit is largely geared around using his mobility in fun and interesting ways, which gives him a really distinct playstyle while still allowing for a lot more creativity than most everyone else on the roster, since you're abusing the physics engine rather than utilizing an ability that works the exact same way every time you cast it. I don't find myself looking at him and thinking this is what this character is supposed to do, but rather I wonder what all you can do with that. Paladins champions exist on the exact opposite end of this spectrum, with kits that often seem somewhat confused and unfocused at first glance, but that allow for a lot of experimentation and diversity in playstyles if you're willing to develop them, assuming you don't gravitate toward any of the offensively bad ones. There's always a general idea of what a character is meant to bring to a team when you look at their abilities, but the question of how you go about doing it can vary wildly for a couple of key reasons. The first is the fact that champions and paladins are, as I've said before, designed to be more general purpose, which has admittedly resulted in some redundant champions being thrown into the mix, like Androxus for people who manage to make even fewer friends in school and whatever this mess is, but I'm willing to take that trade if it means that the characters themselves are more internally varied. The second, and far more important reason, is the existence of the talent and loadout systems, which allow the player to decide which specific attributes of a character they want to gear their playstyle around and to make modifications as to how the character's kit actually functions. Talents are fairly simple. At the beginning of each game, you're able to choose one of 4 that alters either your character's base functions or the way that an ability works or interacts with the rest of the kit. Loadouts are quite a bit more complicated. For every champion, you're able to build a number of custom loadouts, each comprised of 5 cards selected from their specific pool of 16. There are 4 cards for each standard ability that each apply different status effects, bonuses, or utilities, and 4 cards that can alter the champion's base stats or otherwise grant different passive effects. Some of the changes can be pretty significant, like making one ability take another off cooldown when you hit it, or making an AoE heal apply more healing to you when you only hit your allies with it and not yourself. Each card can be set to a level from 1 to 5 that determines the strength of that specific bonus, as well as the amount of points that will be added to the loadout's total value. Every loadout must have a total of 15 points, so building them becomes a challenge in balancing what changes most benefit your playstyle and how strong each of those changes ought to be. These systems allow players to experiment with different ways that a character's kit can be used and determine which they find the most enjoyable, all while letting them whittle down the specifics of what they want for their playstyle to an insanely specific degree. If I pick Inara and run the no fun zone, I'll need to adjust my playstyle from that of someone with trimmers and plans tonight, but I'll still be fulfilling the same basic role as the team's main tank. And that's just scratching the surface of what this means for the game's meta. Where this stuff gets really fun is when you look at things like Flank Nando, where the loadout and talent systems allow you to play champions as off-role hybrids and develop playstyles that can vary wildly from player to player. Maldamba is one of my favorite champions in the entire game, largely because of how varied your playstyle can be with him. His big gimmick is that his weapon is a spitting cobra that he reloads by throwing it forward as an arcing projectile that stuns the first person it hits, which is a really cool gimmick on its own, but it's made more interesting by these systems. If you're running a standard loadout talent combo, he plays like a control support, keeping his teammates alive with sustained ranged healing while offering some area denial and crowd control. However, if you run Wakono's Curse with a mal-damage loadout, your heal can now be used to damage enemies, sacrificing some of your supportive capabilities but drastically improving your offensive ones and recontextualizing the entire kit in a way that still makes complete sense. Instead of standing back and lobbing your gourd to give your allies an advantage where they're fighting, you're sneaking up on enemies and throwing it at their feet so that they have to fight you where you have the advantage. Instead of using your reload to escape a dive, you're using it to trap someone inside the damage of your gourd. Instead of using your dash to escape, you're using it to chase or immune damage and crowd control. All of this and you're still a support. The heal still works on your allies and your ability to control the point hasn't gone anywhere. It's just not your primary focus anymore. Those are already 2 extremely distinct ways to play the character, but within both of them you can spec your loadout into your dash, your gourd, your heal, the speed of your reload, the rest of your base stats, or any middle ground between all of them, and whatever you pick will result in different methods of approaching every fight. The loadout system may help define basic playstyles, but stuff like this is made possible by how separating talents allows them to change champions to such an insane degree, with the very best being those that alter the way they play entirely. Which is why every talent that acts as little more than a buff to damage or tankiness should be fired into the sun. Conditional modifiers like Eevee's Over the Moon don't bother me because they actually change the way she's played, but headshots with precision weapons and direct hits with blast damage weapons already deal more damage than regular hits. Making them deal more damage isn't going to have that same effect. All that, and I haven't even mentioned shit like Firefight, which I guess exists so that even Victor mains have a reason to look down on Victor mains. I could go on, and believe me, I'd love to, but the point I'm trying to get across is that talents are a great concept that theoretically give every character a lot of additional depth, especially in combination with the loadout system. But as long as flat buff talents are in the game, I can't shake the feeling that the system is being squandered. Any issues I have with implementation aside, these systems add a significant layer of depth and strategy to the game that is entirely entirely absent from Overwatch. The generally accepted measurement for depth in games discourse is the number of unique, meaningful choices that a player is able to make, so why don't we just be empirical about this? In the interest of keeping things simple, let's just say that there are at least 2 viable ways to build a loadout for every talent. That means that every character in Paladins has 8 possible ways that their kit can operate compared to the singular static functions allotted to each hero in Overwatch. If you want to do away with the arbitrary 2 viable loadouts per talent thing, finding out the total number of ways you can build a single champion requires a lot of math. But in the interest of being thorough, I have hired virgins to perform the mathematical rituals required to find out, and after sacrificing a TI-83, they arrived at a celibate 568,353,280. Thank you, virgins. Please stop picking May. What I'm trying to say is that Overwatch is really bad at allowing for player expression, and taking one look at me, it's pretty obvious that I was told to be myself just a few too many times growing up, so I'm naturally going to put a lot of stock in being able to express myself. Champions and Paladins feel as though they're designed to provide the player with a series of tools to develop a playstyle that best suits them. Heroes in Overwatch feel as though they're designed to do something. I'd imagine a lot of people enjoy that sort of streamlined and precise approach to kit design. I won't argue that stabbing someone with a rapier isn't a bit more elegant than beating them to death with a tactical rail. I just know that I personally find it kind of dull. I do think it's important for me to clarify, though, that I'm saying Overwatch is simpler, not that it's easier. For real this time. Anyone who's tried Paladins out for themselves has probably noticed that the game's difficulty lies somewhere between Spyfox and whichever of these would make you the angriest when you first start playing it, and there are a few reasons for that. The first is that the game secretly cues you into bot matches for the first 5 levels without telling you, because it seems Hi-Rez are more interested in guerrilla marketing their possibly cancelled mobile game than giving off a good first impression. It wouldn't be so bad if they explicitly told you that you need to play 1 bot match to ensure that you've got a basic idea of how the game works, but being forced to play multiple matches where characters are running into walls and using their ultimates on cooldown before actually getting to play the game is fucking stupid. I sort of get what they're going for here, but ranked is locked until level 30, so I don't understand the choice to start preparing players for it this early on. Another thing that makes Paladins feel easier is the way that the hitboxes are designed, because Paladins uses static capsule hitboxes in the vein of Quake and Unreal Tournament rather than the more accurate ones in Overwatch, which is actually a bit more complicated of an issue than it initially appears to be. What people don't seem to realize is that the hitboxes weren't made that way on accident. They make a lot of sense for the way that Paladins was originally designed. Paladins started development as the spiritual successor to the PvP and global agenda, Hi-Rez's definitely cancelled MMO. Because the game was originally more akin to a MOBA or MMO played from the first-person perspective than a first-person shooter with MOBA and MMO characteristics, the design didn't actually call for pinpoint accurate hitboxes due to the focus on mobility and ability usage over wicked sick flick shots. This was reflected in the way that the shooting was handled too, with DPS champions being given projectile weapons while hitscan ones were reserved for close-range assassins and duelists and had aggressive damage fall off at range. The challenge came from predicting movement and leading your shots, or closing the distance and avoiding damage, rather than perfectly lining up your crosshair on the enemy's player model. And since the models were acting as more of a guide for what to predict than a perfectly accurate representation of what would count as a hit, Hi-Rez decided that the game was more suited to the capsule hitboxes found in most arena shooters than those of a more standard modern FPS. That said, this is an explanation, not an excuse. There have been fast-paced arcadey shooters with accurate hitboxes before, and the sun didn't collapse, and the capsules themselves are a few small nations bigger than they ought to be, even if they aren't quite as bad as they look from the glitch to shit kill cams that must have been outsourced to Korea for all the liberties they insist on taking. Also, you may have noticed that I said this is all because of the way that Paladins was originally designed, and that's because over the past few years, the time to kill has been steadily driven down, and I'm starting to think the only reason it hasn't crashed through the floor yet is because mobility is already there to act as a cushion. Toss in the fact that the majority of DPS champions have hit-scan weapons now, 2 of which are snipers and 3 of which are machine guns, and yeah, the hitboxes have become a bit of a problem. In my eyes, there are 2 realistic solutions to this. Either fix the hitboxes to reflect what the game has become, or balance the console versions of the game separately, bring back the hypermobility, change the firing squad's machine guns to projectile weapons, rework every champion with auto-aim, and raise the time to kill to the point where larger hitboxes like this make any kind of sense. I'd choose door number 2 in a heartbeat because mobility meta has always been the best, and if you disagree, then I'm truly sorry about whatever happened to you, but I need you to understand that it doesn't excuse the the person you've become. So yes, in terms of basic aiming and shooting, Overwatch is a far less forgiving game than Paladins, which is why it's unfortunate that the improved hitboxes are in service of heroes who don't require aiming to begin with and others who get free team wipes at the press of a button. I know it's not exactly a fresh criticism to point out how so many of Overwatch's ultimates being win the game buttons makes it frustrating to play, but it bears repeating since we're 2 years in and almost nothing has been done about it. I understand that there are people who like that they work this way, and if you're one of those people, that's fine, but do me a favor and take some deep breaths because I get the impression you're the type to forget. Blizzard has been improving on this with the more recent heroes, since they're generally weaker and or have somewhat reasonable windups, but they've also gone back and broken one of the only ultimates in the base game that I guess wasn't quite bullshit enough for their liking. For anyone who didn't play Overwatch at launch, let me tell you about the time when Zarya's ultimate was fair. If you used it at the wrong time and didn't bait out enemy mobility before chucking it into a teamfight, several characters could escape it, meaning that it not only was a utility, but a utility with counterplay. It required actually thinking beyond how many people will this hit, so naturally Blizzard gave it a cripple to bring it up to the no Symmetra main left behind level of everyone else's. I mentioned earlier that Zenyatta is my favorite character in this game, and one of the reasons for that is his ultimate being a fuck your ultimate button, and that reflects my sentiments perfectly. That said, requiring a fuck your ultimate button or specific hero selections is about the least interesting way you could possibly have given these abilities counterplay, especially when knowing whether or not they're up is reliant on guesswork since they don't operate on standard cooldowns like those in a MOBA. That's not a criticism of the way that ultimates charge in these games. I actually think it's really clever how this method incentivizes players to be proactive in order to get them up faster. And I'm not going to pass up on an opportunity to sweat nervously at respawn, so I'll go ahead and call it genius. It's a criticism of the fact that the ultimates themselves are far too powerful to have ambiguous cooldowns, especially when they aren't being telegraphed properly. In Paladins, ultimates don't fire off until after they've wound up and played an audio cue, which you might think is the case in Overwatch since they added voice lines to cue in ultimates, but several of the voice lines don't start to play until after the ultimates have started firing. Pharah's can kill just about any non-tank before her voice line is even started from 5 to 10 meters away, and her jetpack becomes effectively silent about a second after she takes off or uses jump jet, so she can easily get that close from behind without being heard. Average reaction time to auditory stimulus is 0.17 seconds and 0.25 for visual ones, meaning that from this distance and accounting for RNG, projectile speed, and spread, Pharah's ultimate can reasonably kill the majority of heroes in less time than they can even be expected to react to it. You could argue that it's the player's fault for letting her get behind them, but Overwatch doesn't exist on a 2D plane like a MOBA. You've added an entire third axis of movement here. When just about every character in the game can burst you down in under a second, expecting the player to keep track of every single enemy's position at all times on top of everything else as the only method of countering the ultimate, which only works if your hero is designed to survive or counter it in the first place, isn't difficult. It's unreasonable. This is a symptom of a larger issue though. Ultimates have to kill this quickly because of how low the overall time to kill is. If the ultimates had proper telegraphs and counters, they'd become borderline useless at the highest level because the person casting them would be bursted down before getting any notable benefit. Paladins has a higher time to kill, and the ultimate design benefits from that greatly, as it means that the majority of them can be utilities that help set up crazy plays through follow-up and teamwork rather than being a button that makes crazy plays for you. The fact that Pip's evil mojo deals no damage, doesn't heal, doesn't hold anyone in place, and can actually save enemies while still arguably being one of the strongest teamfighting abilities in the entire game is a testament to that. The ultimate itself is an explosive that turns everyone in a 30-foot radius into a chicken with 1500 health, preventing them from using weapons or abilities for up to 4 seconds. Using it on an enemy who is under that health threshold will actually bring them back up to that base 1500, an amount that was chosen specifically because Pip isn't capable of dealing the damage required to kill more than a couple of the chickens on his own before they change back. Even the ultimates that behave similarly to those in Overwatch aren't as frustrating to me. The equivalent to Widow's ult isn't given to a character who can one-shot you the instant you're around a corner, and also doesn't last half a fucking dynasty. It's great, and most of the ultimates follow this design philosophy, but that's not to say that they are remotely perfect. Some can't be blocked by shields, some make the caster invulnerable, and some can be used by lobotomites. Some of them even refund part of their charge when they whiff, because I guess having to aim abilities would be too confusing for new players, which would actually explain the direction that champ designs have taken recently. I can't be fucked to go into the bad ultimates case by case, but I feel that it's my civic duty to say that Khan's ultimate needs to be a skill shot because it's hilarious and I'd like to be erect when I use it instead of overcome with shame. or at least erect first. The silver lining is that there are systems in place to make sure ultimates can be countered by means other than just being the right person. The reason I said up to instead of a flat 4 seconds is because the effectiveness of crowd control, as well as several other things, can be altered by any character through the game's item shop, and I promise it's not as scary as it sounds. The item shop in Paladins isn't like what you'd find in a MOBA, where there are a few hundred items that each have 10 stats, 6 passives, and names based on outlandish mythical artifacts like Thrathengandr's Unseeing Third Eye or the PS Vita. The sorts of things those items would change are covered by loadouts, so the shop is instead made up of 16 tiered items that each do a single specific thing. The items are split into 4 categories: defense, utility, healing, and red. The separation is significant because you can only build one item from each category per game, at which point you can only upgrade the item you've selected or buy and upgrade items from other categories. You have to weigh up whether or not reducing the effectiveness of crowd control is more important in this specific game than direct or blast damage, as well as understanding that if an enemy with a strong crowd control ability sees you didn't choose that path, they may focus you harder for the remainder of the match. Upgrades are also increasingly expensive with each tier, which means you need to consider the diminishing returns you'll be getting from focusing all of your credits into one item that you think is important versus what you'd get from purchasing cheaper, potentially less crucial ones. You have to be thinking about what items are the most important at every point in the match, and how best to use your abilities based on the items the enemy team has taken. And you might think I must be out of ways to talk about how much deeper Paladins is than Overwatch by now, since I've covered just about every system in both games, but I've got one last thing to touch on. When I talked earlier about how Paladins suffered from major mobility nerfs, I was talking about more than just the nerfs to movement abilities. The base movement of every character was changed as well. The most significant of these changes was the decrease in player jump height, because it made several areas of the old maps frustrating to navigate due to how finicky some of the jumps had become. The workaround that Hi-Rez implemented for this was to increase the player's jump height when there is an object X units in front of them, because fuck work, I guess. That said, this change actually resulted in something that I think is really cool, and I haven't managed to find a definitive name for it anywhere, so I'm just going to call it Z-bouncing since that makes it sound more technical, and that helps my case. Z-bouncing is essentially positioning yourself near a wall and angling the camera into it before you jump so that you can get as much distance as possible without being forced to use a movement ability. This allows you to significantly increase the height and distance of your jumps, which can either be used with regular jumps to make you a harder target to hit in combat, or combined with movement abilities to effectively double their value. On one map with a single champion, I managed to find multiple areas where I could use this to make jumps that are otherwise impossible without wasting her key damaging ability. And it also makes taking off his Drogos without using thrusts slightly less pitiful. Using this to take off is more of a general required use thing because of how much he's been ruined by the mobility nerfs, but nailing Maeve's specific jumps consistently is dependent on good spatial awareness and a bit of finesse, and this is an example of something found in a lot of games called tech. Tech is often used as a catch-all term for any kind of technique that results from abusing a game's systems and mechanics in order to do something that the designers didn't know about or intend for players to use. Some examples of this would be wave dashing, bunny hopping, or the one from Tekken that sounds vaguely racist without context. Tech adds an additional layer of depth and raises a game's competitive skill ceiling by rewarding players for experimenting and mastering difficult inputs that allow them to play the game more efficiently. From what I can tell, the only universal tech in Overwatch is some very basic animation canceling, which I can't help but find really boring by comparison, especially given that it's something found in pretty much every other FPS, including Paladins. What's frustrating is that Overwatch is probably capable of having much more depth than Paladins in this way, with tech specific to individual characters, but just about every time one of those is discovered, it's swiftly removed simply because it was unintended. But you can't run from your mistakes forever. I'm faster than you, Dad. On the flip side, when these are found in Paladins, they're generally left untouched, provided they aren't game-breaking. And I know it sounds like I'm advocating for bugs right now, but I think allowing tech to exist and evolve is crucial to raising the skill ceiling of just about any game. Mercy's skill ceiling, for instance, is notoriously low, but once upon a time, players discovered that her Guardian Angel ability could be cancelled at a specific time to slingshot past the point she was flying to. Using this properly required careful timing in order to make sure you were slingshotting yourself the correct speed and distance past your target, and the fact that something that so drastically increased her skill ceiling without breaking her was immediately replaced with a gimped version that behaves the exact same way every time, regardless of timing, is so emblematic of the problems with Blizzard's entire approach to design. Well, we can't have players learning how to do something that wasn't intended in order to play the character most effectively. That might muddy our incredibly specific and restrictive vision of what this character is meant to to be doing? The poetic irony is that this change just wound up creating a much stronger new boost tech, which is actually harder and way cooler, so I'd recommend making the most of it before history inevitably soils itself. Blizzard is so anal about trying to dictate the game's meta, but meta isn't designed, it's discovered. The problem with Overwatch is that there's very little to discover because the moment you break out of the neat little box that's been put aside for you, Papa Jeff is going to be there to smash your head in and reseal it with concrete, all the while whispering not to worry about it because maybe that thing digging into your ribs is a legendary. With your luck, it's probably a bunch of whites though, which might be comforting depending on what region you're queuing in. That aside, if this restrictive design is in the name of balance, I have bad news because all of the ground that Overwatch made up this way is largely nullified by the fact that Paladins has a system in place that allows players to manually balance the compositions in each match, that being a pick ban phase. If a champion is considered stronger than the rest of the cast, players can ban them out before the match starts. Additionally, there can only be one of each champion in every game, so if the enemy team drafts a broken team composition, it's partially your fault for letting them have it. Paladins is also able to design everything around Siege, a single round-based mode that consists of capturing a neutral point and then pushing a payload into the enemy team's base. Scoring is simple and makes ties impossible. The first team to 4 points wins, and you get a point for capturing the middle, a point for successfully pushing in the payload, and a point if you manage to defend a payload push. The only catch is that you can't win a match on a payload defense, so winning due to spawn advantage is outright impossible. The fact that Siege has these 3 different mode states in conjunction with all of the game's other systems means that players have to carefully draft around the enemy's picks, how best to split their itemization, and how the comp works in each phase of the match. You can't just draft a team that's good at capturing the point and then switch to one that's good at pushing the payload. You have to think about it and you get punished if you don't. The only mode in Overwatch with anything close to this is Lockout Elimination, and once you know it, it's a lot of people's favorite since it's the only one that forces them to make strategic choices and doesn't have fights decided by single abilities. It's also not the arcade mode they decided to make permanent, and the part of my brain that orders Fred Durst posters whenever I black out tells me it's because it shines a spotlight on the game's problems by fixing them. For those of you who haven't spotted it yet, there's actually a link between just about every single criticism I have of Overwatch, and if you're guessing it's a simple lack of depth, then thank you for playing, but I'm afraid you've been outplayed by the big brain Paladins main. Barring the time to kill, just about everything I hate about this game was made that way because this game has hero switching in it. Heroes can't be particularly complex because balancing that would be impossible when both teams can have whatever composition they want at any time. There can't be a pick ban phase because the only proper counters for several abilities are specific heroes, so a substantial amount of games would be won or lost based on the last pick. The heroes need to be designed as direct counters to incentivize the use of this system because if one of your teammates picked Genji and is therefore respawning, they'll need a pretty stiff nudge to justify sacrificing the 50% of their ult charge they've been building up for the past 5 minutes. I get that it's meant to add a layer of strategy by letting you adapt to the enemy team with your picks, but in practice it mostly just results in everyone abusing whatever composition is the most dominant on whatever map you're currently playing on, or constantly swapping back and forth with minimal strategic thinking due to the rock, paper, paper again design of the heroes themselves. I don't think hero switching works with how hard you're leaning on counters, abilities, and ultimates, and it can't even be removed because everything else in the game has been kneecapped for it. I understand that a lot of people won't be taking any of what I'm saying seriously, given that I'm not exactly an esports pro at this game, but the biggest difference I've spotted between my gameplay and that of the real gamers is how well they can click on the bad men. If the only significant ways to improve at this game are to get better at aiming or breaking the Geneva Convention, I can't really think of a reason to play it over any of the numerous games that do the first bit better. I also understand that a lot of Overwatch players aren't interested in competitive design, and that my reasons for disliking it are theirs for the opposite. But I tend to play multiplayer games fairly casually most of the time, and I think the lack of player expression and ways to facilitate janky fun builds and team compositions makes the game less enjoyable on a casual level too for a lot of the same reasons. The most fun I had in Overwatch while I was working on this video was when I fucked around with my friends as a team of 6 supports, but that's about as wacky fun times as things ever got. There's not enough variety in the ways that the game can be played for me to enjoy it competitively or casually, and the feedback loop of instant gratification that the game is designed around fucks me off no matter how I'm playing because how cool I feel when I press Q good isn't enough to outweigh how frustrating it is when I get Q pressed good on me. So naturally, this is the point where I heartily recommend that everyone plays Paladins instead, right? Fuck you. Don't act like you know me. Look, I could talk for a long time about how Paladins has slowly been pruned of a lot of what made it fun and different to begin with, what with the constant nerfs to mobility and shift towards spammy champions designed for nerve clusters, but I think it makes more sense to go to the root of the problem. I'm sure this won't be the most shocking thing you hear today, but I am a man of many regrets, and I think one of the biggest when it comes to this whole YouTube thing would be the time I said I like Hi-Rez without clarifying that I meant I like the developers and community people working there and not the company itself, because for some reason I didn't expect them to continue existing over the next year to repeatedly make me look like a moron for saying that. From the introduction of Essence all the way to the existential fever dream of Cards Unbound, there's not really much to say about the management at Hi-Rez beyond how the fuck has this company not burned to the ground yet? Even the lack of polish comes down to them. I'd wager a big reason the developers aren't able to come close to AAA standards is that they're a smaller team being given absolutely laughable deadlines to push out new content with the perpetual excuse of feature freeze is a myth designed by gremlins to rob you of lovely skins. Regardless of how much I value good systems and mechanics over polish, the amount of technical issues present in this game is unacceptable. Plus, all of the improvements in Paladin's competitive design are rendered completely fucking pointless by the fact that you can only queue comp with more than one other person if everyone in the party has finished their qualifiers and are platinum and below. And if I have any sway over anything, I'd like to request that whoever made that decision is forced to solo queue ranked for a few weeks before being allowed to reevaluate it. There's a chance that things may get better now that they've spun their development teams into separate studios that they're just acting as a publisher for, and I'll acknowledge that the executive producer they brought in to mop up Cards Unbound has done a solid job since taking over, but Hi-Rez has a history of recruiting their management out of classrooms with letter blocks and backpack hooks, so any recommendation I could give for this game would require a 15-minute asterisk and a waiver. So what the fuck did I even make this video for? Probably because the concept of a hero shooter really appeals to me. Playing around with a few abilities and learning the intricacies of a character without the free time required by an MMO or the self-loathing by a MOBA is something I'd really love to play around with. But I can't say either of these games really nails it. Luckily, I know a game that does. Gigantic is a hero shooter developed by Motiga that the majority of people seem to be mostly unaware of. It's also one of my favorite multiplayer games of all time. Now I know what you're thinking, and it's even more hilarious and original than you think it is, but let me point out that Paladins has an owl champion I hate, Overwatch has an owl skin I nothing, and the exercise in production overcompensation that is professional Overwatch is literally called the Owl. It's not because owl, it's because I genuinely don't think there's a single aspect of Gigantic that I wouldn't consider a direct improvement on the formulas of Overwatch and Paladins. Because unlike Paladins, I don't have to apologize for the parents, and unlike Overwatch, I don't have to apologize to mine. It is still a hero shooter though, so the most natural place to start explaining why would be the heroes. Every member of Gigantic's cast manages to be distinct from one another without having a single pre-assigned playstyle or kits that feel remotely unfocused or generalized. This is partially because kits are designed to have abilities that play into a certain skill set and combo into one another in different ways, and partially because of the leveling system. Throughout the course of every game, players earn experience for scoring objectives and killing enemies, and every time they level up, they can choose different upgrades for their abilities as well as a talent at level 5. Every ability has 2 branching upgrade paths that split twice, meaning that there are 7 possible ways for each ability to function. This is essentially the loadout and talent systems from Paladins with the implementation of the item shop, which streamlines all of them in a way that makes players more likely to play heroes in a more diverse manner. The loadout system is fantastic for allowing players to experiment and find different playstyles for whatever champion they're playing, but they'll often settle on one loadout talent combo because it's the most effective for how they want to play. Because Gigantic allows you to upgrade abilities in any order you want without arbitrary level restrictions, you're not only deciding which upgrades you want for this specific match, but also the exact order that you want them in, which is spreading several decisions across the entire game rather than condensing millions of options into one choice that you make before it's even started. Apologies for the guesstimates on these, but I'm trying not to break the bank and those virgins don't come cheap. It also means that players are less likely to have the exact same abilities in every game because their specific needs will vary depending on the match itself. I stand by everything I said about Paladin's shop being a good way to handle counterplay and adaptability, but adapting to the enemy team by altering your kit is a lot more fun and interesting than using base stat bonuses. The system itself is technically less complex than those in Paladins, but I still think it's a better implementation of the same core concepts, and that any divide it creates is closed by the added depth in Gigantic's actual combat. There are a few things about the combat in Gigantic that separates it from Paladins and Overwatch, namely that it leans much harder on the word hero than it does on the word storage shooter, which is evident from looking at the roster and comparing the 8 pure brawler heroes and 2 that can be either melee or ranged to the collective 3 melee characters in Overwatch and Paladins. This is all in service of the fact that the melee combat is actually designed. The most significant changes come from the addition of dodging and attack modifiers, as both attacking after dodges and while airborne will result in special attacks that grant damage and mobility bonuses and, depending on the hero and upgrades you've chosen, can also apply different on-hit effects. Cold Kick Combo makes Paco's first melee strike within 3 seconds of using an ability deal 50% bonus damage and then either crack armor or deal 100% bonus damage on frozen enemies. So taking this upgrade makes attack canceling into abilities crucial for bursting people down. Melee strings also vary from hero to hero, meaning that the timing and damage of each strike is different based on who you're playing, so the ideal time to perform melee cancels varies wildly. Trip has a quick 7-hit string that ends with a long, slow strike, but if you use her throwing daggers to reset after the 6th hit, you can perform 12 melee attacks quickly with no recovery period. These heroes have also been given kits that enhance their melee capabilities rather than ones that apologize for them, so fighting is less about knowing when to hold left click and more about closing the distance, avoiding damage, and comboing abilities to give yourself as many advantages as you possibly can. This is all a result of melee attacks and abilities in Gigantic being low commitment, meaning they can be cancelled into other abilities and dodges, which would likely cause a lot of frustration if it wasn't balanced out so well by the stamina meter. Sprinting, dodging, and jumping all drain stamina while in combat, which means that fights are high commitment even though attacks aren't. Canceling an ability into a dodge to avoid damage and then following up with a dodge attack is fun because it requires very careful timing and consideration, because doing it more than a few times without managing to kill your opponent means forfeiting your ability to retreat. The time to kill is high enough for fights to be actual fights, and you need to account for the possibility that the person you're smacking around is calling for backup and your stamina won't start regenerating until you've killed them. Combat functioning this way has also resulted in players discovering some unique and rewarding tricks like the Beyblade tech on Taito, which requires precisely canceling a jumping dodge attack into a blade dance and turns you into a giant, angry, sea-splitting projectile. It's an attack that can be used to engage enemy players and bait out movement abilities so that you can use swoop to finish them off, or as a last-ditch escape if you swoop into a fight that you've horribly misjudged, which would be cheap if it didn't require a hefty chunk of stamina and a lot of skill to pull off consistently. Gigantic wants you to earn your accomplishments, and that's one of the absolute best things about it. Killing enemies is infinitely more satisfying in Gigantic than it is in other hero shooters because of the amount of work that went into putting them in the ground. Even the focus abilities Gigantic's take on ultimates are designed to make the player think as much as possible, but I can't really talk about them without first attempting to explain how the game's actual mode works, so let's get lost together. Much like Paladins, the core of Gigantic is a single competitive game mode with several internal objectives, but while Siege is a generic point capture to payload push, Gigantic is unlike anything else that I have ever played. The basic gist of it is that each team is collecting power for their Guardian, which involves controlling power circles, summoning creatures, and killing enemy creatures and players. Power circles are laid out so that there are a few that heavily favor each team, with anywhere from 1 to 3 in neutral positions that the teams compete for control over. The majority of power collected in a game is from orbs that spawn at 2 of these power circles every 35 seconds in a set pattern. These can be collected by players, but are most often collected by whichever team's creature is currently summoned there, as they do it faster. Once your team generates 100 power, your Guardian will fly across the map and pin down the enemies to expose their weak point, dealing damage depending on how much power the enemy team collected before you hit 100. If your Guardian doesn't do it automatically, your team attacks the weak point to score a wound, and all of this is repeated until one team wounds the enemy Guardian 3 times. Toward the end of each game, a clash will start and either some rocks will fall over or the entire map will switch to a new area for the final skirmishes. We are already a tiny bit more complex than stand on circle, push rectangle, and we haven't even talked about the different creatures that you can summon at each power circle. The decision of what to summon is based on which environmental effect would be the most useful in the surrounding area. A Cyclops spawns walls that block enemy players, a Bloomer rapidly heals nearby allies, a Cerberus reveals all nearby enemies on the minimap, and a Drake doesn't call back the next morning. You can only have 3 of these equipped per match, and they all have different sub-variants with specific bonuses and upgrade requirements, but I'm trying to keep this under feature length, so I'm not going to go into all of that. Upgraded creatures are tankier, deal more damage, and collect power orbs faster than young ones, but upgrading them requires focus. Focus is built up the same way as ultimate charge in Overwatch and Paladins, with the most notable difference being that it can be charged up to 3 times. Focus is used to upgrade creatures and to cast focus abilities, Gigantic's version of ultimates. The abilities themselves get stronger with each level of charge, which already makes deciding whether or not to use your focus more interesting than deciding whether or not to use your ultimate, because even when you know there's a good opportunity to use it, you still have to think about whether or not you should. The fact that Focus has not only more than one application, but multiple possible levels of effectiveness at more than one application makes it a hell of a lot more interesting than regular ultimate charge. And what ties it all together is the fact that getting targeted by a level 3 focus ability doesn't instantly mean you're going to die, because again, Gigantic expects players to earn their kills. Unless they're playing TMAT, but I've been told it's poor form to mock the disabled, so I'm staying far away from that one. So if the game is competitive, varied, fun, and gorgeous to boot, how come no one ever talks about it? I'd be willing to bet there are quite a few people watching this who remember Gigantic's announcement in 2014 and had no idea that the game ever came out. Well, that's because midway through development, Motiga wound up burning through all of their funding as a pre-revenue startup and had to lay off every single one of their employees, which you'd think would be curtains for Gigantic, so how did the game ever get released at all? Well, the day after the layoffs, every single employee showed back up to the office and kept on working as though nothing ever happened. They showed up every single day with no promise of pay because they believed in the idea and they cared. Still, they needed money to finish the game, so management started shopping it around to publishers in the hope that one would bite, and the only offer they got was from Perfect World, the high-res of game companies. All of this resulted in a turbulent dev cycle that had the game coming out of alpha at the same rate as a human child, and to make matters worse, Motiga wound up having to enter a partnership with Microsoft to extend their funding, in effect losing several months of development time to porting Gigantic to the Microsoft-mandated Universal Windows platform rather than sorting out its technical issues, which resulted in the game having severe crashing problems on computers with under 6 GB of RAM. So, until they could find a proper fix, Motiga decided to have the game check the system and give players who didn't meet the requirements a pop-up on launch, preventing them from purchasing items or playing the game, as they knew it would be a waste of their time and money. This version of the game was released in beta onto the Arc client, the perfect world of game launchers. Shockingly, the launch on Arc to no fanfare didn't exactly set the world on fire. Gigantic's last chance to capture an audience came with its release on Steam when it officially left beta, at which point it was bombarded with negative reviews from brainlets complaining that they didn't meet the requirements to run it. Now, I know I'm probably not going to make many friends by saying this, but it's shit like this that makes me fucking hate gamers sometimes, and I'm sorry to hit you with a hard R out of nowhere like that, but I'm not mincing words on this one. The developers at Motiga poured their blood, sweat, and tears into this game, literally working for free for a community of people who viewed them as disposable. I genuinely do not understand the reasoning behind giving a free game a negative review because you can't run it. None of the microtransactions are even available through the Steam page. The game will not allow people to spend money on it unless they're able to play it. The only thing they possibly could have lost is a little bit of time because they couldn't be fucked to read the requirements that were plainly spelled out for them. Just to put a nice little cherry on top of all of this, a few months after the Steam release, Motiga had to downsize their staff, at which point gaming news outlets started reporting that the company was being shut down entirely and didn't bother to update the headline when the remaining employees told them that they got the story wrong. I guess they were just counting on it eventually being right, and congratulations because Motiga doesn't exist anymore. The January update was the final content patch for Gigantic, and the official servers shut down on July 31st. One of the most dedicated and talented development teams I've ever seen that was working on one of the most original multiplayer games I've ever played is now gone, and the product of their passion and talent is too. So if anyone from Motiga is watching this, I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you. Thank you for giving this game to the people who loved it while they could, and thank you for powering through all of that bullshit to do so. The only silver lining is that it is technically still possible to play the game now that everything is said and done, and as much as I wish that there was just a private server browser to keep the game going, I can't help but be grateful for anything that means it's not outright gone forever. I've linked a Discord server in the description where you can find a modded client that'll allow you to host private matches without having to use any of the official servers. It's missing a lot of the updated characters, animations, maps, and UI refinements that were in the game proper, and as of right now, the only way to invite people is to directly give them the server's IP and have them join through the console. So, unless this becomes a Shrine of Amana situation and the game is rebuilt by the community, this is more to let people who already love the game keep playing it than anything else. It's still definitely worth installing if you want to give the game a go, just go in knowing that it's not going to be everything I've been showing here. I've never ended a review by telling people to do something before, but if you're watching this video on a computer with a power supply you don't have to feed, do yourself a favor and give this game a try. It's free, it's fantastic, and most of all, it deserves to be played. I'm not just saying that because it got shut down either. I play high-res games. This is not a new experience for me. And even though they aren't entirely blameless, the work and care and love that Motiga put forward deserves some appreciation. Even disregarding all of the shit they went through over the past few years, this game wasn't given a fair shake on release because people dismissed it as just another cash grab Overwatch wannabe. You might think a game with a completely different perspective, style, set of objectives, movement, combat, ability system, design philosophy, and leagues more depth that was also revealed first wouldn't get that kind of pushback for simply existing within the same subgenre as Super Global Combat Fortress 3. But if spending the past few years reading YouTube comments has taught me anything, it's that there's no shortage of people who likely think subgenre is the name of that fancy underwear their cousins save for special occasions.
Felt weak when I heard about you.